This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Last week we did a video about The Chain by Fleetwood Mac. It's a great song, and if you didn't see the video, you should really check it out, link in the description, but while working on it, there was one section that really stood out to me when the guitar did this. It sounds great, obviously, but what really got me excited was that it introduced me to a brand new chord, the Augmented Sus2, which is one of the prettiest things I've ever heard. I gave a brief explanation as to why, but I feel like there's probably enough going on here to justify its own video, and my job is to feed the content beast any way I can, so let's take a closer look. Unsurprisingly, the Augmented Sus2 chord is a combination of two different things, the Augmented Triad and the Sus2 chord, so if we're gonna understand it, we need to examine both of those first. Let's start with Augmented. This is kind of the black sheep of the triad family. It's the only normal triad that doesn't show up in the major scale. What do I mean by normal here? Well, Western music is largely based on an idea called tertian harmony, which just means that we build our chords in stacks of thirds, so if we took a root, added a note a major third above it, then added a note a minor third above that, we'd have a major triad, whereas if we flipped those, putting the minor third on the bottom and the major third on top, we'd have a minor triad instead. These are the two most consonant triads. Major and minor thirds are fairly pleasant on their own, and when you stack one of each, you wind up with a perfect fifth, the most consonant interval besides the octave. As such, major and minor triads are probably the most important chords in Western music, and they pop up everywhere. But there's a couple other chords we can build like this. Like if we stack two minor thirds on top of each other, we get a diminished triad. This is a lot less consonant because instead of a perfect fifth, we've got a diminished fifth, also known as a tritone, one of the most dissonant intervals. But that dissonance serves a purpose. The tritone is a highly directional sound, pushing you towards a resolution. This wants to resolve to this. So while we only see one diminished triad in the major scale, it's doing a pretty important job creating momentum and pointing us back to the root. But what if we stack two major thirds? Well, that gets us the Augmented Triad, which is a bit of an odd duck. It's dissonant too, but not in quite the same way. Here, the dissonance doesn't come from what's in the chord, but from what's missing. The most dissonant interval in an Augmented Triad is the Augmented Fifth, equivalent to a minor sixth, which on its own sounds pretty nice. A little sad, but nothing too harsh. The only reason the chord as a whole feels off is because that augmented fifth precludes the existence of a perfect fifth, denying us the stable structure of the truly consonant triads. This is compounded by the fact that the Augmented Triad is symmetrical. We said we built it from two major thirds, in this case E to G sharp and G sharp to B sharp, but if we were to add another major third on top, we'd end up with B sharp to D double sharp, which is just another name for E. We're back where we started. This makes the chord ambiguous. E augmented, G sharp augmented, and C augmented all contain the same notes, so in a sense, every Augmented Triad has three simultaneous roots. It's not even clear what it is, let alone what it wants to do, so while the diminished triad is a very directional dissonance, the Augmented Triad is more of an ambient dissonance. It suspends your sense of tonality without really telling you how to fix it. But even though they don't show up in major, Augmented Triads do have their own scales. Probably the best known one is the whole tone scale, which is just all whole steps from bottom to top. In it, every third is major, so every triad is augmented, and since the scale's symmetrical, it perfectly accentuates the triad's ambiguity. Just like every note in an augmented triad could be the root, so could every note in the whole tone scale. It's often used to create a disorienting, dreamlike feeling in music because there's no clear way to resolve anything into anything else without leaving the confines of the scale. Anyway, that's augmented, but augmented triads on their own are nothing new, so let's flip to the other side, suspended chords. These are when you take a chord and replace the third with one of its neighbors, usually the fourth. This creates a feeling not unlike pulling a rubber band. You can hold that tension if you want, but as soon as you let go, it's gonna snap back to its more stable, comfortable state, which in this case is the original consonant triad. It's almost like you're creating a resolution within a single chord using the expected tertian structure to drive dissonance without ever actually changing the root. Sus chords also have another use. They hide the tonality. Basically, the third of a chord is the thing that tells you whether it's major or minor, but both the major scale and the minor scale use the same fourth, so a sus4 chord gives you no such information. This doesn't really come up if the suspension resolves quickly, but if you hang on it for long enough or place it at the start of a section, it can be a really effective way of creating mystery because your listener isn't sure which way it's gonna go. But the fourth isn't the third's only neighbor. If you're at all familiar with how numbers work, you've probably already figured out that we can also replace it with the second. This gives gives us what's called a sus2 chord, and it works basically the same way. You can even combine them both into a sus2-4 chord if you want to get real fancy, but they all have roughly the same effect. The only real difference is that the fourth is a half step away from the major third, whereas the second is equally close to the minor third, so depending on the quality of your target chord, one or the other may lead to a slightly more satisfying resolution. But okay, let's bring it all together. How do we make an augmented sus chord? Well, sus4 probably won't work. After all, the augmented triad tends to come from the whole tone scale, which has no perfect fourth. If we use the upper neighbor, we wind up with augmented sus♯4, which actually also sounds pretty nice. Huh, neat. Anyway, I was gonna say we should stick with the lower neighbor, giving us augmented sus2, but hey, either way works. The point is, we're hiding the third degree of the augmented triad, which gives us some really interesting harmonic behavior. Basically, the sus chord wants to resolve, but the augmented triad can't really be resolved too. It's not stable enough. But it also doesn't really imply any further motion, it just sort of sits in its dissonance, so the suspension doesn't really have a good place to go. It wants to move, it needs to move, but the only place it can go doesn't really want it, so it winds up just pointing us into nothing, directing you toward a weird dissonant void. It's awesome. But okay, some of you may have noticed that there is one possible solution here, one way out of this that does give us a nice satisfying resolution, and that comes if we stop looking at this as a suspension. Heck, we kinda have to stop looking at it as an E chord at all, because if we step back and look at the other two notes, we have F sharp and C, which is a tritone. If we add an A in between them, we've got F sharp diminished, and slapping the E back on gives us F sharp half diminished 7. This is the 7 chord in G major, so we can resolve to that. It's a bit awkward though, because we've got an E in the bass, which either has to jump up a minor third to G, which is fairly weak bass motion for a resolution, or it has to step down to D, putting the G chord in what's called an inversion, which just means the bass note isn't the root of the chord. Either way, it's kinda weak as resolutions go, but we can fix that. All we have to do is use a deceptive cadence, which is where we take a chord that's supposed to resolve to 1 and resolve it somewhere else instead. The most common target for this is the 6 chord, and in G major, the 6 chord is E minor, which means our bass just has to sit still and... nice. Actually, from there, I think we can go back to viewing it as a suspension because the augmented triad can kinda play that role too. After all, it's also replacing a consonant chord tone with one of its neighbors. The augmented fifth is the same as a minor sixth, so if we wanted to, we could view this whole thing as like a double suspension, replacing both the non-root notes with their less stable counterparts. This brings me to a really important point. When you're analyzing a piece of music, the same set of notes can represent multiple different chords depending on their behavior. We saw this at the start with the various augmented triads where any note in the chord could potentially be the root, but it's not just limited to symmetrical chords. That same ambiguity can pop up in all sorts of places, and which label you give it can have a profound impact on the shape of your analysis. In the chain, I went with augmented sus2 because it never really tried to resolve. It felt more like it was suspending the tonality, which is something that both sus chords and augmented chords are good at, but in another context it might have made more sense to call it something else. But either way, it's a fantastic sound, and I can't wait to play around with it some more to see what it can do. And speaking of playing around, let's talk about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with over 25,000 classes in music production, songwriting, and lots of other skills. In the past, I recommended a course about mixing from a producer named Young Guru, who's worked with incredible artists like Beyonce and Jay-Z, and Skillshare actually teamed up with him again to produce another course all about recording and mastering at home. It's a phenomenal class covering ways to make your home studio as effective as possible with things like equipment, sound conditioning, and even shaping your room to better accommodate the frequencies of the music. I learned a lot, and if you want to check it out, Skillshare is offering 12-Tone viewers a free 2-month trial membership if you click the link in the description, which includes full premium access so you can try out all sorts of classes on whatever you want to learn, from music to cooking to graphic design. And if you like what you see, sticking around is super affordable, with premium plans starting under $10 a month, so why not give it a shot? Again, the trial's free, so there's literally no risk. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patron, Susan Jones. If you want to help out and get some sweet perks like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.